time, and the next half hour we'll spend talking about how to kind of best practices around establishing a center of excellence in organizations. Some of what we've learned from organizations that we work with. But first, a big thank you to the sponsors for making this happen. I really appreciate it, and it's I've looked at the session agenda, and it's going to be like a full packed 2 days full of really great sessions. Please stay in touch with the communities even after this event. So here's some of the links to join on LinkedIn and on Twitter as well. So like I said, we'll spend the next half hour on looking at best practices to scale adoption of the Power Platform with a Center of Excellence. My name is Manuela. I'm a program manager at Microsoft. I'm part of the Power Apps Custom Advisory team. We work with some of our marquee and strategic customers to help them accelerate their adoption when they onboard onto the Power Platform. And through some of the learnings that we have through working with some of these customers, we create best practices content that is then available for a much wider customer base to use. We're quite a small team, but aiming to scale through writing down some of what we've learned or recording videos, for example, on YouTube as well. In terms of agenda, we look a little bit at the motivation and purpose of establishing a CUE. So why is that something that you as a customer would want in your organization? We look at some of the roles and responsibilities once you have a CUE established. And then we look at tooling approaches, which is the Siri Starter Kit. So I'll explain that a little bit as well. Before I get started, under this link, aka.ms Power Platform Guidance, most of the things that I will talk about today, we've written down here, and we're sharing the best practices under this link. So those are kind of adoption best practices in terms of administration and governance, as well as nurturing and educating users. We keep that that content up to date constantly. So we've added an article to it yesterday around Dataverse for Teams governance, for example. So I recommend checking that out to learn, to get some more information about some of the best practices that I will talk about. Kind of to set the scene a little bit, this is how we see the IT landscape before low code. Adoption processes used to be a lot different before the Power Platform or before any low code tools were around. Each column holding up an organization, each kind of adoption effort was a multi-year effort, and organizations kind of formed around those columns. Very often those pillars were very old, and IT organizations were sometimes scared to make changes for fear of what would break or what would happen if anything changes. But in the shadows between kind of these pillars, business applications grew in the cracks. And many of you on the call today are some of those flowers that grew between the tracks. And that's because the business users had needs that just weren't met by those pillars, by those large kind of monolithic efforts. Sometimes those were, spreadsheets, SharePoint lists, Access databases, basically anything that business users could get their hands on to make their life easier and make their life better. Sometimes these efforts would grow beyond even kind of the expectation of the people that initially built them or created them. And the goal of today's talk is to discuss a framework for successful adoption, management, and governance of the Power Platform, so that these applications that business users build can thrive and can be successful, but also be secure and adhere upon the agreed governance with the central IT department. So that's kind of to set the scene a little bit. When we talk about a center of excellence, we talk about a function that kind of ensures that the Power Platform strategy is aligned with the digital transformation strategy that the company wants to accomplish. So those two go kind of hand in hand, and there's a firm place for the Power Platform in that digital transformation strategy. Establishing a COE typically means nurturing organic growth, growing the business value, as well as maintaining kind of governance and control around what is going on. A key principle is to clarify why you're setting up a center of excellence and what you aim to accomplish and the key business outcome that you hope to achieve by setting one up. And then get started and kind of learn and evolve along the way. Setting up a center of excellence doesn't happen at the click of a finger. It's a journey. It's something that you evolve with the lessons that you learn. And for many organizations, it's a culture change, not just a technology, not just a technology change. But once you're in a place where that journey is on the way, you really can drive innovation and improvement across the organization. You break down geographic and organizational silos, and bring together people, makers that have the goal of being successful, that want to experiment and encourage each other and grow together, and really share kind of that knowledge and success. And there's some really powerful stories that we've seen with some of the customers that we work with, where people that have never worked together came together to build solutions together that had a massive business impact on their entire organization. Sometimes when we start talking to customers about a center of excellence, they're kind of scared that it means immediately standing up a whole new team, that they need 20, 40, 50 people to create a center of excellence. But really, sometimes a center of excellence is just an idea that evolves, and you can definitely start small with your efforts. My recommendation is that you lay down secure foundations first by setting up data loss prevention policies for the environments, and that just make sure that makers can only use the connectors that you're happy with them using, and can kind of use a combination of connectors that you're okay with, and then setting up a wiki or a SharePoint site or something similar to communicate those policies to your makers. And the point of that really is that if where you are at the moment, you're not ready to support makers in a more formal way, but you're happy for them to use the platform, then put that on the wiki just to set the right expectations with anyone trying out the platform. And then move to evangelize the platform by doing really simple things like setting up a welcome email to welcome new makers. So when someone creates an app or a flow for the very first time, they receive that welcome email. It points them to some learning resources, and that could be official kind of Microsoft content like we have on MS Learn. We do that Microsoft internally as well. So if you create an app for the first time in the Microsoft tenant, you get a welcome email that says "Welcome to the revolution," and that's really how we treat it as well. It's a nice sentiment to be part of a community like that. And then really create a space for those makers to connect with each other, either on Yammer or on Teams, for them to find each other and help each other out, and encourage them to share success stories. And then you really move into that area where you're monitoring. So you see who are those makers, what are they using, what are they connecting to, how frequently things are being used, and then you evolve your kind of COE strategy as you have those learnings, and really tailor that to how your organization is both at the moment adopting the platform, but also what your goals are in kind of how you want to drive that adoption further. This slide is a little bit full of information, but typically when a center of excellence matures, we see certain roles or teams kind of evolve around that. One of them is kind of that almost like exec sponsorship, the low-code strategy team, that is the key decision maker. They look after adoption and change management. They look after empowering new ways of working. They're aligning the Power Platform strategy with organizational goals, and they're really looking at it kind of all up, not just from a single department point of view, but overall aligning that with the organization. And then, of course, there's the Power Platform admin team. They're responsible for environment strategy, for a DLP strategy, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides as well. They will also look at kind of managing the capacity, managing licenses, looking at making data available to makers through custom connectors, through integration, through migration, etc. So they're really responsible for setting up those digital guardrails so that makers can confidently use the platform. And then there's a Power Platform nurture team. Sometimes that's called kind of enablement team or community team even. And they're sometimes this consists of champions. So maybe it's not a full-time kind of team, but some of your champions have an additional role to be part of that nurture team, and they then run kind of internal training events, hackathons. They look after the community there. They can provide mentorship to new makers to make sure that new makers get off to a good start, and really look at evangelizing the platform there. As the organization kind of further matures into using the platform, we do see a need for a team that looks after automation and reusable assets. So that is both kind of setting up automation through Azure DevOps and supporting kind of that application lifecycle management, providing architecture reviews for some of the more complex or critical solutions that are being built, but also really investing in a library of patterns, of templates, of common components that makers can use to build their solutions. And really, if you invest in that part and provide kind of common components, let's say, then your apps will have a more consistent look and feel, but also makers can then start to really focus on the problem they're trying to solve rather than building a header, a navigation, a form, like every single time that they create an app. And then user support. So likely most organizations will already have a help desk, IT support, and it's really aligning kind of with them and making sure that there's guidance, and that guidance evolves with your adoption. There's a ticketing process and there's a clear support process of what happens if someone logs a support request for a specific application. You know, who does the first level support? Do you then get in contact with the maker, or is it just not something that you do? Kind of being clear about that guidance, that guidance that is available there. Let's dive into some of these a little bit more kind of deeply. So one of the things that we talked about is kind of that exec sponsorship, and that really falls into the strategy and vision bucket, where you have a dedicated Power Platform product owner that looks at the adoption across the organization. They're looking at kind of both like top-down education across the organization, and come up with a strategy of how, who, and what will be moved to the platform. So do you have existing InfoPath forms that need to be moved to the Power Platform? Are there heavy like kind of paper forms in use in a specific department that could be used to the Power Platform? Kind of looking at that all up, providing value and education across the organization there. We often get asked about different operating or delivery models. Here's some that we see for kind of center of excellence models, but I kind of think of them as almost like mental models. Each organization has a variation of multiple things in place. Like even if you have a centralized model where all of your requirements are coming into a central delivery team, you will still have citizen developers who are discovering the platform and building apps for their teams. So you will always have kind of elements of multiple of these delivery models, but we find that sometimes just really thinking about how you want to deliver the Power Platform is kind of helpful in the adoption process. So do you want to have a central team of product owners, of pro developers and architects and project managers that have foundational expertise in Power Apps? Or is that not something that you're currently able to facilitate? Or do you have a decentralized model where there's multiple teams across the organization that run kind of the Power Platform adoption in their area, and they have the resources to deliver these to deliver applications, but then you would still have an element of kind of a central model, because you would have a central IT department likely looking after the centralized governance. And then kind of, or do you have more of a matrix model where there's leaders of change and of design and trainers in local teams, and local teams of citizen developers that are plugged into the central structure, where that make sure that there's like nothing gets lost in translation, and there's a communication between kind of the central departments that are looking after governance and the local teams that have have citizen developers. So there's typically kind of a combination of models that we see when the Power Platform is delivered, and maybe that's also a sign of there's nothing really has kind of crystallized out here yet, but I'm sure as the Power Platform adoption matures across more and more organizations, we'll see a model that kind of is the most successful, that most organizations will follow. One bucket that I personally spend a lot of time talking about is administration and governance. It's typically top of mind for organizations that look at rolling out the Power Platform at enterprise scale to all of their users. And that bucket really ensures that digital guardrails are in place so that makers can use the platform and admins are comfortable with what makers are creating. It means managing environments, users, capacity, licenses, making sure the platform is secure to use, but also monitoring resources and usage there. Just a quick time check. Part of that administration and governance bucket is coming up with an environment strategy. So making sure that you have a process for requesting new environments, as well as a dedicated Power Platform service admin role. You have restricted the creation of new environments so that only admins can do that to avoid kind of that environment sprawl. You have clearly defined the purpose of the default environment as a productivity environment for teams and employees, and you have a form or a process in place for requesting new environments. We typically kind of find it successful to set up a tiered approach to those productivity environments. So you've got a default environment with a very restricted DLP policy, and then you have like power user and power developer environments where there's a less restrictive DLP policy in place, but as an admin, you control kind of the makers that have access to those environments. And then we also recommend having training environments in place, so shared environments for internal training events, where the DLP policy is aligned to those training scenarios. And then you'll have dedicated environments for specific projects, for specific business units. And you would work with those teams and business units to establish what environments they need. And typically that's a dev, a test, and a production environment, where in the test and production environment, no one has maker access. The deployment is happening through Azure DevOps, and only in the development environment you'll have makers, and that ensures that critical projects or business important projects have the application lifecycle management support that is needed for their success, basically. So no one changes anything in production underneath the user and pulls the app out there. So as you consider your environment strategy, definitely the application support that is needed will be of influence there. So the level of kind of complexity, is it a productivity app that doesn't have high level of usage, that is only supported by the maker itself, that typically lends itself to being in one of the productivity environments? Or is it an important or critical solution where you need a more robust ALM process? You have kind of longer development cycles, and maybe you have a formal IT support that owns the support of that application. So typically all of that kind of plays a role in coming up with an environment strategy. Like I said earlier, really recommend setting up a wiki or SharePoint site where you communicate what the default environment is for, how to get a custom environment, why you would want a custom environment, but also the responsibilities of a maker in, if you don't need your environment anymore, then delete it, or if you don't have if the app that you've developed isn't used anymore, at least unshare it from the people that it's still shared with, so it doesn't kind of clog up the environment there. And then we talked a little bit earlier, mentioned in the environment strategy about the data loss prevention policy strategy. So the DLP strategy enforces rules for which connectors can be used together. Connectors can be in business, non-business, and blocked buckets. And we typically recommend kind of keeping the DLP policies that you have to a minimum, but making sure they fit the environments that you have set up. So you would have a restrictive DLP policy on the default environment. Then you would have shared environments, so a shared power user environment where you've got a less restrictive DLP policy. And then you would have your business unit or project specific dev, test, and prod environments where the policy is really targeted to the connectors that are used for those projects. And then you might have like a central IT environment or a special purpose environment where you've got a specific policy set up for those environments as well. You can have tenant policies, so they apply to kind of either all environments or a number of environments, and then you can have environment policies that only apply to one specific environment there. There is so if multiple policies apply to the same environment, they all apply. So in order to make this manageable, we do recommend kind of really always kind of performing an audit on the policies that you have and making sure they're kept to a minimum in order to make that easier to maintain, make that easier to manage. So some of the things that we talked about can be automated to reduce the work on the admin persona. There's both PowerShell commandlets as well as management connectors that are available in Power Apps and in Power Automate to create those automation scenarios. So you can really, I think our philosophy is really that you can leverage the Power Platform to manage the Power Platform by using those connectors to build your own kind of governance solutions there. One of the solutions that's built on top of these management connectors is something called the Siri Starter Kit. Actually, I'll go to the next slide. So you've got kind of the existing offering in the admin center. You've got the connectors that I've mentioned. With the Siri Starter Kit, what we've done is we've put together a collection of templates that implement some of the best practices. So it's a solution that you can download and install in your environments. It provides you with a cross-tenant dashboard. That uses the audit log to kind of bring in an overview of how your apps are being used, who your makers are. You can use it to identify trends over time and really kind of use that to develop a strategy for adopting the Power Platform. And then it contains a lot of other templates like the welcome email that I mentioned earlier. So there's a template for how to set that up. So the only thing you have to do is make sure the text is according to your policies, but the whole heavy lifting of creating that flow is done. So if you haven't looked at the starter kit yet, then we really recommend kind of exploring it and seeing if there's specific parts of it that you want to use and pull out. So the starter kit kind of falls in the same building blocks that we see as part of that we see kind of in terms of roles and responsibilities. So there are some templates for the admin persona, some templates for governance to kind of establish audit processes, to archive unused applications, to identify applications that are highly used. some nurture components to kind of create a community, and then theming components to create a template that can be used across the organization by makers. Again, similar to kind of the best practice content that I mentioned earlier, the Siri Starter Kit has frequent releases. So typically once a month we release an update that contains both bug fixes as well as new components. And then earlier this week, we released a new version with some components for managing Microsoft Dataverse for Teams environments, where the team owner that creates a Microsoft Dataverse for Teams environment is prompted to provide a business justification for the environment that they've created. And the admin has increased ability to look at what is going on in those environments. Like I said, yeah, you can monitor app usage. I think I was a little bit too ambitious with the content that I wanted to go through in half an hour. So I'll skip ahead to nurture and support, because I think really like administration and governance is really important, but it's not the end goal. The end goal that you want to achieve is to nurture your makers, to find those, app gurus, those business users that have a problem that need to be solved. So governance is there to enable you to nurture, and it's not, the end goal is not to lock everything down. So some of the best practices for those nurturing is really creating an internal community by organizing hackathons, identifying your champions, and you can do that using some of the dashboards available in the Siri Starter Kit that show you your app makers. And then you want to evangelize, share kind of success stories, even share some stories from external communities that you've seen, like maybe from our bloggers, so that are relevant to your use cases. Organize show and tell sessions, and sometimes we see that happen up to like a very high leadership team, where senior leaders get visibility of the applications built by the business users. Organize adoption campaigns and focus on your internal kind of training and career strategy as well. So what happens to a maker that is successful? Do they stay in their role? Is there a strategy for them to grow further and become a mentor, or maybe a full-time Power Platform developer? Are there opportunities for those makers, and is there a need for creating kind of training that's very specific to your organization? Or what upskilling strategy do you have for makers, and how do you encourage makers to make time for that learning? So I think one of the challenges is obviously always time, and it's really, if kind of the Power Platform adoption isn't encouraged top down, where like the line manager of that person can encourage them to make time for learning that, then that kind of it won't happen. So you really can drive kind of that organizational change through that top-down approach of allowing people to just explore the product there. So I think that it's a really important part of the Power Platform adoption is making sure that you have a nurture and an enablement strategy as part of that. I'm just going to bring up the chat to see if there were any questions.
Manuela, no question yet. Oh, there is one.
So I'll quickly read it out. What model fits best by organization size for a small company? So yeah, that it's actually a really tricky one, because we see it. It really depends on how that organization is structured at the moment. Do they already have kind of a more agile approach, where maybe a model of like a matrix or a biz DevOps, where those departments work closer together, makes more sense. And kind of typically in smaller organizations, we see them being more agile, like they already work closely together on other projects, for example, because resources are tight. So typically we see that like some of those models work better for smaller organizations, whereas kind of larger organizations typically have more of a centralized model already in place, and then it kind of makes sense. How can we make a COE profitable and not a center of cost? So I think there's an element of measuring the value of applications that are being built. So one of the very often the part of the COE is kind of that upskilling and training communities across the organization, and then an element there is not just to measure the amount of apps that are being built or the amount of makers that you have, because that number doesn't indicate value, but really looking at what was it like before and what is it like now. So before, they spent time on paper forms that were being carried between desks for someone to sign it, and now you've got an automatic approval, and it takes kind of a third of the time, or much probably even less, and really putting a number on that and measuring that value is kind of really helpful in I guess not making the COE profitable, but really proving the point that it is successful. So yes and no. So there definitely are. So the question was if there is a direction to make the Siri Starter Kit part of the admin. So there are elements that are going to be part of the where they are on the roadmap to be part of the admin center. Not all of them. Sometimes we use the Siri Starter Kit as an early kind of testing ground to get feedback on some of the features and see if they're if there is a need for them, if they're being highly used, if you get a lot of feedback from them, then can influence the roadmap. So for example, we get a lot of feedback around the dashboards, the reporting that we've built in the COE kit. So we're now working with the admin team to incorporate some of those reports in the out-of-the-box reporting, so that customers can get started without having to install the COE kit.